This book is called Linnea in Monet's Garden, and it's written by Christina Bjork and Lena Anderson. Just think, I've been in a famous artist's garden, and I've been in Paris. My friend Mr. Bloom was with me. In fact, the whole thing was actually his idea, but maybe I should begin at the beginning. I love flowers. I'm even named after a flower, and I'm interested in everything that grows. That's just the way I am, and that's how Mr. Bloom is too. He's my upstairs neighbor. Mr. Bloom used to be a gardener. He's retired now, which is good because it means he has lots of time to spend with me. Mr. Bloom knows just about everything there is to know about plants. It seems like that anyway. When I go to visit him, I like to look at a book that Mr. Bloom has about a French artist, Claude Monet. Monet loved flowers too. He painted lots of pictures of them. Probably his best-known flower paintings are his pictures of water lilies. There are reproductions of Monet's paintings in Mr. Bloom's book, and old photographs of the artist, his wife Alice, and all 8 children. There are also pictures of their garden and the big pink house where they lived over 100 years ago. The longer Monet lived there, the more beautiful the garden became. He planted more and more flowers. Later, he used the garden in his paintings. He even had a pond to put in the garden so that he could have water lilies to paint. I've looked so often at Mr. Bloom's book that sometimes I think I know them all. Monet, Alice, and the 8 children. And I almost feel that I've been in the big pink house. I can pretend that I have anyway. Mostly I pretend that I'm standing on the Japanese bridge looking at the lily pond. One day I told Mr. Bloom about it. It's possible to really stand on that bridge, said Mr. Bloom. You mean it's still there? I asked. I read in the paper that they were collecting money to restore the house and garden. They had become completely run down and overgrown, but now they look almost exactly as they did when Monet lived there, and they've been turned into a museum. Anybody can go there and look, but Monet and his children can't still be around. No, said Mr. Bloom. They died a long time ago, just like your great-great-grandfather and his children. How old would Monet be if he were still alive today? Let's see now, said Mr. Bloom, counting on his fingers. 145 years old. Well, I said, if someone is that old, then he must be dead. But what about the garden? How do we get there? First, we'd have to get to Paris, said Mr. Bloom. Oh, I said, that's a long way away. It's a long way away, said Mr. Bloom, but it's not impossible. And just think, everything was finally arranged so that I could go to Paris with Mr. Bloom. But it took all my savings and a little more. We went in August because Mr. Bloom said the water lilies would be best then. Our hotel was called the Esmeralda. It was a tiny and old, but Mr. Bloom thought it was probably the loveliest hotel in the whole city of Paris. It was right on the River Seine, which flows through all of Paris. The part of the city where we stayed is called the Left Bank. From my window, I could see all of Notre Dame Cathedral. That is the city's most famous church. The book The Hunchback of Notre Dame takes place there. Mr. Bloom hadn't read the book, but he had seen the film. It's about a terribly ugly bell ringer named Quasimodo and a beautiful gypsy named Esmeralda. The hotel is named after Esmeralda, of course, and in the hall there's a painting of her dancing with her little pet goat, Dolly. There's also a red couch in the hall where the hotel's dog, Cannelle, always sits. The cats Mona and Lisa lie in the armchairs, but Tiger prefers to sit in the window, staring and purring. Mr. Bloom discovered that the house was built in 1640. That is a long time ago. At that time, there was a secret passage under the house leading down to the river. The floor in our room was sagging with age. The walls were made of uneven stones, and there were ancient beams in the ceiling, but the furniture wasn't that old. It was only about as old as Monet. In the front of the hotel is a park, which belongs to the church of Saint Julien Pauvre, which means Saint Julius the Poor. The city's second oldest tree grows there, supported by a cement pillar. It is a robinia, or false acacia, which came all the way from America in a basket and was planted there in 1681. It still has fresh green leaves, even though it's more than 300 years old. I couldn't reach up to them, so I took a leaf from another tree in the park to press in my travel diary. There were so many interesting things to look at from my window, especially the dogs in Paris. Lots of dogs go out by themselves, particularly on our little street. Cannelle knows them all. Her boyfriend, Baskerville, belongs to the English bookshop around the corner. My first day in Paris, I saw a very old and elegant gentleman walking down the street. All of a sudden, 2 enormous dogs ran right into him. It looked as if they were going to knock him over. Then Cannelle ran out to join them. Soon, all 3 dogs were jumping all over the poor man. He managed to break away and continue down the street with the dogs following after him. I found out later that the biggest dog belongs to the old man. He goes walking there several times a day and thinks that it's fun to be almost knocked over by the dogs. He started saying hello to me when he noticed me watching from my window. "Imitate the old man with the dog," I say to Mr. Bloom sometimes, and when he does this imitation, I laugh so much that I almost fall over. But now on to the most important part, Monet and his flowers. Our first day in Paris, we took the metro, the underground train, to a museum called the Marmottan. Many of Monet's paintings are there. It's one thing to see them in a book, but something quite different to see the real thing. I know that now. The Monet paintings at the Marmottan used to belong to the artist's youngest son, Michael. When Michael was 86 years old, he was run over and killed. Since he didn't have any children of his own, he left his father's paintings to the museum. Most of the pictures are hanging in large rooms downstairs. They were discovered that Monet had not painted only water lilies. He had also painted steam engines, churches, mountains, the sea, and people. There were snow paintings too, but I didn't like those very much. "But this one is nice, Mr. Bloom," I said. We were standing in front of a painting with 2 white water lilies. I stepped a little closer to the picture and looked at it. It was then that I noticed that the lilies were nothing but blobs and blotches of paint. But when I stepped away again, they turned into real water lilies floating in a pond. "How could he know how to paint like that?" I asked Mr. Bloom. "He had to stand near the canvas to paint, so how did he know what it would look like from a distance?" "Let me think," said Mr. Bloom. "Maybe he tied the brush to a long stick," I suggested. "I don't think so," said Mr. Bloom. "I think he had to practice painting like that for such a long time that he knew exactly what to do." "Come over here, Linnea," said Mr. Bloom. "You have to look at this." "Why?" I asked, because I hadn't even noticed that little picture before. It was a seascape with some small boats at sunrise. The sun looked like an orange blob. "This is an important painting in art history," explained Mr. Bloom. "It's called Impression Sunrise. Monet painted his impression of sunlight reflecting on the water. After that, the art critics, the ones who wrote about art in the newspapers, started calling Monet an impressionist. They didn't mean it as a compliment. They thought painting impressions of the moment was a waste of time. Painting should be precise and carefully done. They should be a little gray and dark, too. At that time, almost no one liked Monet's paintings. Oh, what a lot of blobs, people said. They thought they looked messy, sloppy, and unfinished. And such loud colors. But Monet didn't care what they said. He didn't want to mix black into his colors. He wanted to paint his impressions with bright dabs of color that would shine and sparkle on the canvas and make it come alive. And Monet saw that it wasn't only water that sparkled. Leaves could also reflect the sun, and skin, clothes, and even stone walls could shimmer sometimes. But it was the water that Monet thought was the most fun to paint. What color is water, actually? One moment it looks blue, and the next moment it's white. Those were little moments that Monet tried to capture in paint, but it wasn't easy. Those moments disappear so quickly, and it takes so many of them to paint a picture. All his life, Monet tried to paint his own true impression of light. He was never really satisfied with the results, but he never gave up trying. Upstairs in the museum were paintings by Monet's artist friends. The critics also called them impressionists. One was named Pissarro. Some others were Renoir and Sisley and Marisot. Berthe was the only woman in their group. In those days, women who wanted to be painters usually ended up keeping house for male artists or becoming their models. Monet and most of his friends were poor, since no one wanted to buy their paintings. There are letters in the museum that Monet wrote begging to borrow money for food, rent, and paints. Imagine, today people pay a fortune for a Monet painting. In the museum gift shop, I found a poster of my Monet, the one with the white water lilies. Luckily, it didn't cost a fortune. We went downstairs and looked at the real painting again. Then I sat down for a while in front of a painting with a little boat. "Do you think the boat is still there?" I asked Mr. Bloom. "We'll see tomorrow," he said. To Giverny. Early the next morning, we took the metro to the train station called Gare Saint-Lazare. The train left shortly after 8 o'clock. I was a little disappointed that it didn't have a steam engine, as in the Monet's painting, Gare Saint-Lazare. It took only an hour to get there, following the River Seine. We passed beaches, boats, docks, houses, and lots of hanging trees, weeping willows hanging over the water, and high-rise tree. By that I mean poplars. We got off in the town of Vernon. At the station, there were bicycles for rent. You could ride to the village of Giverny, where Monet's house is. "Do you have any child seats for the bicycles?" asked Mr. Bloom. "I'm sorry, sir, there are no child seats," said the man at the bicycle rental. "I can ride by myself," I said. "Not on these busy roads," said Mr. Bloom. "Please, Mr. Bloom." "When you're older," said Mr. Bloom. "Today we're taking a taxi." "Oh, no, not a taxi," I said. "But first we have to buy some things for our picnic," said Mr. Bloom. "Oh, no, not a picnic," I said. But then we found a nice bakery where we bought a long, thin loaf of bread called a baguette. And what a wonderful cheese shop there was. How could we ever decide which to buy? Finally, we chose a small goat cheese and a somewhat larger cow's milk cheese, in case I didn't like the goat cheese. In another shop, we bought pâté, tomatoes, and nectarines. We got some mineral water and a little bottle of apple cider for me, plus a small bottle of wine for Mr. Bloom. At the square, we found a taxi that drove over the bridge to the other side of the Seine and alongside the river. "Mr. Bloom, look," I cried. "Look up there. You can see the pink house." And then we were inside. Mr. Bloom paid the entrance fees, and left our picnic basket with the lady at the door. I ran ahead of him and out into the garden. It's funny with things you've thought about a lot when finally you get to see. They almost always look different. "Mr. Bloom," I said, "it doesn't look anything like I thought it would." "It doesn't?" said Mr. Bloom, a little worried. "No," I said, "because I never could have imagined all this big and this many flowers. If we could have looked at this garden from above, it probably would have looked like stripes of gravel paths and rows of flower beds in different colors." Mr. Bloom knew the names of almost all the flowers. In the blue row, there were flax flowers, bluebells, delphiniums, foxgloves. In the pink row, there were peonies, hollyhocks, and roses. By the wildest path, there were nasturtiums and orange flowers practically covering the gravel path. It was as if the flowers on one side of the path were trying to crawl over to the flowers on the other side. A couple of rows had flowers of all different colors. Some were so tall that they hung out over the path. I could squat down under all that green and pink and yellow and see flowers all around me. Next, we looked at the pigeon house and the turkey pen. Can you think of a funnier looking bird than a turkey? Small blue flax flowers, foxglove, hydrangea, busy lily at the foot of the tree, hibiscus, hydrangea again, one of the many, many roses, and poppies. We both had our cameras with us, and I had my sketchbook too. It was hard to decide if we should look or take pictures. A cat followed us around. Monet's kitchen. You can go inside the pink house and look at Monet's bedroom, but not the children's, and the old studio and the yellow dining room. Best of all is the blue kitchen. One of the chairs must have been made for a child. I tried sitting in it when no one was looking. You aren't allowed to take pictures inside the house, but luckily there are postcards of all the different rooms. I sat out on the back steps as Monet's family used to do. I had seen that in Mr. Bloom's book. We were sitting here and pretending that we were Monet's family. I wrote home on a postcard. The garden is really nice. The flowers are bigger than the ones at home, except for the balsams. Now we're going down to look at the lily pond. Love from Linnea, plus a cat. Finally, the Japanese bridge. After we looked at both the garden and the house, the best part was still to come, the lily pond. To get there, we had to cross the garden and go through a tunnel under a main road. Oh, look, Mr. Bloom, I cried. There's the Japanese bridge. And when at last we were standing on the bridge, it was so thrilling that there were tears in my eyes. And in Mr. Bloom's, I'm sure I saw a few. What was it, I said Mr. Bloom. It was possible. That's right. And now we're really here, I said. I could never be more now than right now. If we don't come back another time, that is, said Mr. Bloom. We looked down at all the water lilies, red, pink, and white. Another plant, a wisteria, grew on the bridge itself. I took a leaf to press in my travel diary. Look there where the bamboo is growing, said Mr. Bloom. There it was, a little green boat. It looked almost like the picture in the Marmottan Museum. The Monet children used to go rowing in this pond. We saw some big fish swimming around in the water, Mr. Bloom said said they were carp. They help keep the pond clean by eating insects and plants. Let's say we can't look at the bridge again until we've gone around to the other side, I said. Why, said Mr. Bloom, so we can get our own impression of the bridge, just like Monet, I said. But by the time we got to the other side, all of my impressions were gone and forgotten. A bird had flown by and a friendly man in a checked jacket had said hello, and we had looked at the wheel that opens the floodgate, letting the water into the pond from the River Rue. Oh, well, I guess I wouldn't make much of an impressionist. Neither would Mr. Bloom. But Monet practiced capturing impressions. Every day he studied his bridge. He discovered that it looked different depending on what time of day it was and the weather. It was sunlight that made the difference. Monet painted many pictures of the bridge, and none of them is the same as the others. He would take several canvases with him, painting a little one each day as the sun rose higher in the sky. People thought he was strange, painting the same bridge over and over again. When Monet was an old man, he got a cataract on his eye and became almost blind. He kept on painting anyway, but his pictures were almost all red. When he finally dared to let a doctor operate on his eye, all the other colors returned to his paintings. I took out my sketchbook and decided to draw just one water lily. I thought it would be too hard to draw the whole pond with the clouds reflected in the water at the same time as the seaweed that was swaying under the water. My water lily turned out all right, but I wasn't really that satisfied with it. But then Monet was never finished with his pictures either. Sometimes he was so dissatisfied that he would take the whole pile of paintings and burn them out in the garden. There were lots of little bluish-green bridges in the garden. Just think, the boat was still there, as if the same one that's in the is that the same one that's in the painting? Mr. Bloom told me that Monet bought the land where the lily pond is when he was 53 years old. 3 years earlier, he had been able to afford the house. People had finally started to like his paintings and to buy them. I took pictures of the pond from a lot of different angles. Mr. Bloom was afraid that I would fall in when I was taking the water lily pictures. This is the impression the water lilies made on my camera. Under an arch of climbing roses, we found the bench where Monet used to sit and look at his lily pond. Naturally, we went over and sat down just as he used to do. Tell me about when Monet was old, I said. It was then that he got his great idea, said Mr. Bloom. He started to work on the biggest pictures he had ever painted. They would cover the walls of a big round room. No, it would be 2 rooms. Monet had to build a new studio so as to have room for the pictures. He painted and painted for 10 years, the last 10 years of his life. When the panels were covered with paint, he started to paint over parts of the pictures to make changes. As usual, he wasn't satisfied. Finally, his best friend told him that he had to stop before he destroyed the paintings. At that moment, they were already masterpieces. Monet didn't think so, but he did stop making changes. Are the masterpieces still around? I asked Mr. Bloom. Can we go see them? The water lily rooms are in the Orangerie in Paris, said Mr. Bloom. That used to be the king's greenhouse, but now it's a museum. But the rooms have been closed for repairs for several years now. I hope they've opened them again, I said. This picture of Monet sitting on the bench was taken the last summer of his life. The paintings were finished by then, but he didn't want to let go of them. They were still hanging in his studio when he died. He lived to be 88 years old. Picnic by the River Rue. Mr. Bloom, we forgot something. Our lunch, said Mr. Bloom. And I'm starving, I said. This would be a good place for a picnic, said Mr. Bloom, right here by Monet's bench. We went up to the pink house and got our picnic basket, but there we found out that picnicking in the garden was not allowed. People would just litter and make a mess, explained the lady. Well then, we'll find a good place outside the garden, said Mr. Bloom. Not as good as by Monet's bench, I said. But we did find a good place by the River Rue, just where it flows into the garden. There we spread out all our goodies. What a feast, said Mr. Bloom. Could it be any better than this? Yes, I said, on Monet's bench by the lily pond. As it turned out, the goat cheese wasn't all that bad, but the cow's milk cheese was much better. Mr. Bloom thought just the opposite, which was lucky for me. The pâté and apple cider were good too, especially with the long baguette. After lunch, I lay on my back in the grass and watched the clouds sailing by in the sky. Don't fall asleep now, said Mr. Bloom. Soon we have to call a taxi, so we don't miss our train in Vernon. I slept all the way on the train back to Paris. I didn't see a single bend in the river. Back at the hotel, I went right to bed without even waiting to see the old man and the dog. The masterpiece. The museum in Paris with the most impressionist paintings was called Jeux de Paume. The paintings that used to be there now have been moved to the Musée d'Orsay. When we arrived at the Jeux de Paume, there was a big crowd in front of the entrance. We can't stand there and wait, said Mr. Bloom. That could take hours. Then let's go see if the Masterpiece Museum is open, I said. The Orangerie was close by, just across the park. When we didn't see any arrows or signs pointing out the way to Monet's water lilies, we got a little worried. Sorry, but the water lily rooms are closed for repairs, said the lady at the door. But they will be open again next month, and you're welcome to come back then. The thing is, Mr. Bloom explained, that this little girl and I have come a long way to see the water lilies. And we have to go home the day after tomorrow. Can't you make an exception? Unfortunately not, said the lady. The rooms are closed to the public. And when she said that, Mr. Bloom looked so sad that I burst into tears. Oh dear, said the lady. Let me see if something can be done. After a long time, she returned and winked at us. My boss has made an exception for you, sir, and for the young lady. Come along discreetly so none of the other visitors will notice. So that's how we ended up right in the middle of the masterpiece itself. Imagine. We had water lilies all around us. Good thing that I started crying at the entrance. Tomorrow is our last day in Paris, said Mr. Bloom. Oh, no, I said. It's going too fast. I agree, said Mr. Bloom. That's why we'll have to do something extra special. Shall we go up the Eiffel Tower? Maybe, I said. Too bad we've already been to Giverny. Otherwise, we could do that tomorrow. You can do the same thing twice, said Mr. Bloom. If it's something extra special, that is. Mr. Bloom counted our money. Yes, there was enough for train tickets, taxi, and the museum. So the next day we were back in Monet's garden again. This time we could take it easy and concentrate only on a few things instead of running around trying to see everything. When we were standing by the pigeon house, a man in a checked jacket came up to us. So you've come back again, he said. How did you know that? Asked Mr. Bloom. I recognized the girl in the straw hat, said the man. And guess who it was? Monet's step-great-grandson. His name was Jean-Marie Tolgoat, and he was a painter too. But he painted much stranger pictures than Monet's. He said he lived in the village, and when he was little, he used to play here in the garden. "Tell us how it was then," said Mr. Bloom. "Tell us about Monet and Alice and the 8 children," I begged. "Both Monet and Alice died before I was born," said Jean-Marie. "The one who ran everything here was Alice's daughter Blanche, and my grandmother's sister. We called her Lan. And all of us children loved her because she was so nice. I remember how surprised she looked once she saw the sail crossing the garden, but it was only I who rigged up the little bed sheet of the little boat on the lily pond." Jean-Marie had some old photographs of his relatives that he showed us too. And guess what? It was his wife who wrote the book about Monet that Mr. Bloom has. Now it's about time for me to explain a little about Monet's big family, because they were not at all like an ordinary family. Some of it is in Mr. Bloom's book, and some Jean-Marie told us from the garden. Turn the page for the family story. Monet decided early in life that he wanted to be a painter, but his family thought he should work their grocery shop instead. The only one who supported Monet was his aunt, Madame Laticoeur. She had been a painter herself, and she gave him a little money so he could study art in Paris. In Paris, Monet made many artist friends, most of them just as poor as he was. He had a girlfriend named Camille, who had dark hair and dark, serious eyes. Monet painted her often, 4 or 5 women in the same picture, and all of them were Camille. Camille and Monet had a son, whom they called Jean. After that, they got married, although Monet's father was against it. Monet had 2 friends who were not poor, Alice and Ernest Hodecci. Ernest owned several exclusive department stores in Paris, and he bought paintings from Monet for his summer palace. Suddenly, it came out that Ernest didn't have much money as much money as everybody thought. His department stores went bankrupt, and all the paintings had to be sold. Ernest was so humiliated that he left the country. Alice and their 5 children had to fend for themselves. There was even one more on the way. Alice sold all of her jewelry and started sewing clothes for her rich friends to earn money. Her son Jean-Pierre was born on the train when Alice was on her way to visit her sister. That summer, Monet and Camille decided to rent a summer house together with Alice and her children. When Camille and Monet's son Michel were born, there were 8 children in the house, but there was no money. Camille and Alice had only one nice dress, which they took turns wearing. Now comes the saddest part. Camille developed tuberculosis. After Michael's birth, she got worse and died. Monet became desperate. He couldn't paint any longer. He couldn't do anything. He was so unhappy. Alice had to take care of him, the 2 babies, and the other 6 children. It was a good thing they all had Alice. They ended up staying in the summer house for several years because they couldn't afford to live in Paris. Monet started painting again. One day, when he had succeeded in selling some of his paintings, he took the train to look for a better place to live. In those days, the train passed the village of Giverny, and there he saw his dream house, the pink one. And guess what? It was empty, and they could rent it. The whole family moved in. Monet started at once to make changes in the garden. He thought it was much too boring. He got rid of all the well-trimmed hedges and planted flowers instead, plus a large vegetable garden to feed them all. The children thought the garden was a nuisance because it was their job to weed and water it every evening. Germaine kept pigeons, and Suzanne was the one who took care of the turkeys. Blanche loved to paint, and she followed Monet, helping him carry all the canvases. No matter what the weather or time of day, Blanche went along and helped him. In the river Epte, the children used to row and fish and swim. Jean and Jacques caught frogs. One day they caught 60 of them. In France, people eat frog legs. Jean-Pierre and Michel collected wild plants and pressed them. They made their own book about plants, and it was published. Once they managed to cross the oriental poppy with a wild one. A whole new type of poppy was the result. Its Latin name was Papaver Monetti. In the village of Giverny, people thought that Monet and his family were a strange bunch. Was painting pictures any real job? And what about the whole family going out with parasols and picnic baskets and carts just to eat? Nobody had ever done anything like that in their village before. The only one that seemed normal in the family was the lady of the house. But then she was living with Monet without being married to him. But Alice couldn't marry Monet. She was still married to Ernest. And at that time, no one got divorced. After a few years, Ernest died. Alice and Monet arranged for him to be buried in Giverny. A year later, Alice and Monet could finally get married. In the meantime, Monet's paintings had started to become famous. Art dealers came to Giverny all of the way from America. Monet thought it was terrible that his pictures would be taken so far away, but he needed the money for now. They had lots of guests, a cook, an assistant cook, and best of all, according to children, 6 gardeners. When Monet was pleased with his paintings, then the whole household was happy. But when he was not pleased, everyone suffered. Monet's views and moods ruled the house. Lunch was to be served at exactly 12 o'clock, even if the children had to leave school early. The boys' professions and the girls' husbands had to be approved by Monet. Michel did not get to be an inventor, and poor Germaine did not get to marry her boyfriend. Blanche was luckier. She was allowed to marry her stepbrother, Jean, and Suzanne got to marry an American painter named Theodore Butler. Suzanne had 2 children, Jim and Lily, but tragedy struck the family again when Suzanne became ill and died. Her children moved in with Monet, where Suzanne's older sister, Martha, took care of them. After a few years, Theodore married Martha. Many years later, Monet's own beloved Alice died, as well as his son, Jean. Monet became so depressed again that he was unable to paint. It wasn't until Blanche moved back to the pink house that things got better. She dragged Monet and all of his equipment out into the garden. Soon they were standing there painting again, just like old times. But Blanche's paintings never became as famous as Monet's. That was the story of the Monet family, but I forgot one thing. When Lily grew up, she had a son named Jean-Marie, that one that Mr. Bloom and I were talking with, just at this very minute in Monet's garden. Imagine having such a famous father, I said. And so strict, said Mr. Bloom. I think the girls made out best, said Jean-Marie. The boys had it much harder. Think of poor Michel, the one who wanted to be an inventor. He was a good painter, too, but he never dared show his paintings to anyone as long as he lived. Jean-Marie went along with us to the graveyard in the village. There we stood a long time, reading all the names of on the gravestones. Claude, Alice, Ernest, Suzanne, Blanche, Martha, Michael. Sunrise on the Seine. The next morning we had to leave Paris. Mr. Bloom woke me up at 6 o'clock. If you get up right now, we'll have time to see one more thing, he said. No, what? What is it now? I said. Sunrise on the Seine, said Mr. Bloom. Go by yourself, I said from under the blanket. But I ended up going with him after all. It was foggy and damp outside. We crossed the bridge to the island called Isle de Cité. Way over on the left end of the island was a weeping willow tree, its branches hanging over the river. Mist rose from the water flowing under the next bridge. In the distance, we could see the Eiffel Tower. At that moment, the first rays of sun appeared, warming us. I'm thinking of certain paintings, said Mr. Bloom. One of those in the book. I know which one you mean, I said. It's the second most misty of the Sunrise on the Seine paintings. It's lucky that there are some good things about the trip being over. Coming home and telling everybody about it, for example, and seeing how all the pictures turned out. We forgot to take a picture of the old man with the dog, I said. But I have one of Canal, said Mr. Bloom. Do your imitation of the old man with the dog, I said. And when Mr. Bloom did it, I laughed until I fell over. I showed Mr. Bloom my bulletin board where I had pinned up postcards and tickets of our trip, a pigeon feather, and a photo of Jean-Marie. I have some other things in a wooden box that I found in a trash can in Paris. A little monkey, a nightcap, 100 meters, a pink satin ribbon. All of that I bought for the next to nothing at the flea market in Paris. A red book of city maps, a doll pencil case, and a kaleidoscope. Almost everybody knows now that I've been in Monet's garden and that I've been in Paris. But when they ask, how was the Eiffel Tower, I answer, listen, we had far more important things to see than that. And that is Linnea in Monet's garden.